The Chicago Bulls have clinched a play-in spot. Well, that's not anything new. We actually knew that after the Bulls' last game against the Atlanta Hawks when the Brooklyn Nets lost that evening, giving the Bulls enough separation to ensure that they'll at a minimum secure a play-in spot, whether it's the 9 or 10 seed. But as much as the front office and those around the organization might consider this a win, that hey, we've still been able to put ourselves in a position to be in the playoffs. We might not get there, but we still have a shot. And even though we all as fans, of course, will watch the Bulls in this play-in game and will be invested into it like it's a playoff game and hope the Bulls win to squeak into the playoffs, as much as we can briefly get excited about it, it doesn't change the fact that this team, in their current state, is an average basketball team. The definition of mid, living in a land of mediocrity, and because of the NBA implementing the play-in tournament, which I love by the way, don't get me wrong, but because of the play-in, it has rewarded mediocrity and masked the state of which we find this team in, and I want to talk about it further as we near the end of the season in the Bulls closing out their final game. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, of course, guys, be sure to subscribe if you like this type of content. You haven't already. About 50% of you watching are not subscribed, and it would mean a great deal to me if you did, as I'm trying to get to 45,000 subs by the end of the year. Also, be sure to check out our sponsor, Underdog Fantasy. It's a great way to support the channel. Sign up for Underdog Fantasy and get your first deposit doubled up to $100. If you're not familiar with Underdog, let me tell you about the app and my personal favorite that I use on the app, NBA Pick'ems. With NBA Pick'ems, you can pick higher or lower on most players' stats and win money based on the ones you get right. You pick higher or lower, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night if you do 5 Pick'ems and you get them all right. Again, use the code BULLCENTRAL to get your first deposit doubled. Link to the site and the code is in the description and in the pinned comment. Now, the funny thing about this season for the Bulls is that throughout the year, we've been talking about the Bulls getting back to 500. And that being the short-term goal of this group after starting out the season 5-14. Of course, they have never been able to get back to that mark. And they won't this season unless they win all of their remaining 6 games, which I can say with confidence, knowing how inconsistent this team is, that it's not going to happen. But because of the nature of the play-in, and the Bulls always being firmly in that play-in spot since rebounding from that slow start, there's always been this feeling of, well, the Bulls are still in it. They've still got a shot at the postseason, when in reality, if this was just a few seasons ago, prior to 2020 when the play-in did not exist, the Bulls would be out of the playoffs, and all of these bad losses leading up to the end of the season where the Bulls could have made some traction in getting the 8 seed would have looked much worse when the losses meant the difference in the Bulls making the playoffs or not. Now, the Bulls could still very well miss the playoffs. In fact, if I had to take a guess on whether they would make their way out of the play-in and getting the 8 seed or not, I would venture to say that they're not going to make it. But the bottom line is, really in the past month or so, because the Bulls have been locked into that 9th seed, the losses haven't looked as bad, and the discussion and the discourse around Bulls basketball is completely different than it would be if this was 4 years ago, all because of the play-in tournament. Instead of it being meaningless games because the Bulls don't have a shot at catching the 8th seed and we're talking about the Bulls being a lottery team and starting to look ahead at the offseason and beyond, it's now the games still mattering and the Bulls fighting for home court advantage in the 9-10 matchup. It's great for the league because if it wasn't for the play-in tournament, the Bulls most likely would just rest their players and look to lose these final games in the hopes of getting better lottery positioning. And that doesn't just apply to the Bulls, it also goes for all the other teams fighting for play-in spots. Teams like the Warriors, the Lakers, as well as the Atlanta Hawks. It's great for the NBA because it curbs tanking as much as possible when even the middle of the pack feels like they have a shot. But the problem for Bulls fans is that this now has become enough, just enough for management to sell to ownership that this is intriguing enough of a team to keep the fans interested and engaged without losing the fan base. Because as long as there is a shot at the postseason, as long as there is this glimmer of hope, more often than not, the fans are going to be invested until the very end. And the reason I say that's a problem is because that's exactly what ownership wants. Having no issue staying a mid-level team as long as the fans keep coming back and filling the stadium. Because why spend more for a team to be a contender when you can spend less and generate just as much revenue? But if this was a different scenario in which there was no play-in, the Bulls' chances at the playoffs would have been over a long time ago. Because even though the Bulls had started making some strides in the right direction, there was still always a pretty big gap between them and the 8th seed. Like, I don't ever recall there being a time where the Bulls came within 3 games of the 8th seed at any point this season. There was always this big uphill battle they needed to climb to actually try to get to 8th. And in a way, I almost kind of wish the play-in wasn't a thing because it would have meant for a very different trade deadline for the Bulls. The play-in was giving them this false sense of hope that it doesn't really matter what the seed is. As long as we can get to the play-in, we feel we have a shot. We've been able to beat some of the best teams in the NBA. I mean, Mark Eversley said live on the air at Bulls Fest when I was there last summer that he felt they were almost there, even citing losing to the Heat in the second play-in game, who would later go on to the finals, as case in point. Like, dude, if it wasn't for the play-in, you wouldn't have even found yourself in that scenario to be able to use that as an argument. You would have just been straight up a lottery team, a lottery pick that went to the Orlando Magic. And so with this trade deadline, knowing they were right in the mix of the play-in, they even felt they had a shot at making it into the top 6 because the standings were a little closer at that time, they felt some of the trades that were presented to them weren't worth the cost. But if the play-in wasn't there and that battle to get into the playoffs was a much harder path, I don't know. They would have approached things differently in my view. Although I say that, but at the same time, based on AK's post-deadline comments, it was clear he was so out of touch when making incorrect statements about how close the Bulls were in the standings, saying the East was all jumbled together and how the Bulls were only a couple games back of certain teams when in reality they were actually 5 games back. So who knows, maybe they would have deluded themselves into believing they still could have made the playoffs even if the play-in didn't exist. But I guess the point I'm trying to make in all this is, yeah, the play-in is fun. It's a winner-go-home stakes environment, it's unique, but it's ultimately really been screwing us Bulls fans because it justifies what the front office has been doing and it rewards mediocrity. It makes being mid not look as bad as it did before, when in reality, it still keeps you in that perpetual state of basketball purgatory where you're not good enough to contend and you're not bad enough to land a future star-level player by way of the draft. Now, as it relates to the Bulls' remaining games on this season, now that the Bulls have secured a play-in spot and it's going to be 9 or 10, there is this debate on whether the Bulls should just rest up their guys and get ready for that single elimination game, especially when guys have clearly looked fatigued from all of the minutes they've been putting in throughout the season, or just keep having them play, maintain consistent rotations, and not throwing off the overall chemistry heading into the play-in game. Now, am I crazy to think that I would almost rather the Bulls finish with the 10 seed? Because they have shown to play better on the road this season, and also when being an underdog, they tend to perform better. I know the Bulls aren't going to do that, and they're going to do everything they can to get home court advantage, even if it goes down to the very last game. But in my opinion, I feel like it makes more sense to limit the guys' minutes, still have them get some run-in, so they don't lose their conditioning when going into the playing game, but limit their minutes, get the younger guys more playing time, and get your core guys rested up for the biggest game of the season. Because in my view, whether they get the 9 or 10 seed, it likely doesn't matter. I really don't think that's going to impact the Bulls either way. This team is so unpredictable. I honestly don't think it matters. The only thing I can see is their best players being a little more fresh and hoping for the Bulls to get hot on the night of the play-in to get the win. This isn't a 7-game series, it's winner takes all, and the team that is hot that night, they're going to win. The Bulls need to be doing everything they can to prioritize to ensure their players are fully ready to go with as much rest as possible. That's just my opinion though. I would love to hear what you guys think. Don't forget the Bulls are taking on the Knicks on Friday. Until then, guys, as always, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.